Hey everybody, Dr. Ross here. We're going to talk about use post bellum. This is the third aspect of just war theory. And so today we're going to look at what is it? Why does it matter? How does it work? And I'll give you some final thoughts. I do focus on this aspect in my own research, and I've taught this for a while. So I wanted to give you a little overview here based on my experience. Use post bellum from the philosophical tradition of just war theory. It's looking at the moral issue here, justice after war. This is the third aspect that we've talked about, that Michael Walzer has tried to emphasize, not just use ad bellum and use in bello, but also use post bellum, right? Use post bellum, justice after war. This is in part with that philosophical tradition, but political scientists also look at this issue. They refer to this as transitional justice. And that usually refers to transitioning a country from a totalitarian dictatorship into a more democratic society with representative government. And so political scientists are looking at the more political dimensions of this issue. But I look at these two things as going hand in hand. So use post bellum and transitional justice are very closely related, and they overlap in different ways. But just from a philosophical point of view, use post bellum is part of just war theory, and it's more focused on the morality of this issue, and transitional justice is going to emphasize a lot of the political aspects as well. Why does this matter? Okay, I've got a hypothetical scenario that I'm going to read, and then we will talk about this. I have some questions I'll show you, and hopefully it'll make more sense about why does this matter. And I'm sorry my head's in the way. I'll try to move it along the way here. The people of Fredonia have been engulfed in civil war for more than a decade. A tyrannical leader, President Alexander, imprisoned anyone who opposed him and mobilized security forces to intimidate the population. One incident between the government and the people resulted in a bloody massacre as National Guard forces shot into a crowd, killing 12 citizens and injuring another 30. Some members of the military had enough and offered their support to the rebels to openly oppose the president's despotic regime. The president used his remaining military support to launch a chemical weapons attack against rebel strongholds throughout the nation. At first, the UN was uncertain how to respond to the Fredonian Civil War. Most nations agreed that President Alexander was a dictator, but he was the legitimately elected leader of the country, so they could not justify siding with the rebels. Other nations argued that anyone who uses chemical weapons against his own people must be removed from power. The UN was filled with much debate, but little action occurred. As the conflict raged, ordinary men became extraordinary criminals, raping women throughout the nation, slaughtering entire towns and burying corpses in mass graves, and forcibly removing unwanted ethnic groups from their historic homes. As journalists and photographers raised awareness of these atrocities, the world finally mustered the political will to take action. A UN-led incursion put an end to the fighting, but not before 100,000 civilians died, tens of thousands were injured, and thousands of women experienced the trauma of sexual assault. Fredonia is no longer at war, but the country is in shambles. Its economy is non-functioning. Basic infrastructure, roads, bridges, running water, is gone, and Fredonia lacks the capacity to uphold the rule of law. People are desperate to survive, causing many to flee in the hope of making a better life for themselves somewhere else. This is in addition to the more educated elites who decided to leave the country years ago, resulting in brain drain. The UN has begun coordinating with various non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and other humanitarian groups to provide aid, but it will take time before they can meet the needs of everyone. In the meantime, President Alexander and his top aides are in prison awaiting their fate. A new provisional government has yet to replace Alexander's earlier regime, so until that happens, the Fredonian military is essentially running the country, with UN peacekeepers providing additional security support on the ground. What would you do in this situation? What would you do to maintain peace and reestablish justice? How will you reinforce the rule of law? Who should lead Fredonia? What will you do with President Alexander and his top aides? Oh, and what about the ordinary people who were raping women throughout the country? How will you provide justice for victims? Use post bellum and transitional justice matter because even if a country wins a war and they've upheld jus ad bellum and jus in bello, so they've satisfied the first two aspects of just war theory and they've won the war, even if they've satisfied that criteria, they still have an obligation to behave properly after the war is over. So how are you going to deal with President Alexander and his top aides? Are you going to execute them? Are you going to just leave them in prison without a trial? What are you going to do with them? Who should lead the country? Should it be the military? Should you have some kind of election in a country that's in shambles and doesn't even have basic infrastructure like running water? People can't even survive. There's all kinds of immigration taking place because people are running away. It's a very complicated mess when you're trying to rebuild a country after a war. And within this discussion of just war theory, there are certain things you really should not be doing after the war if you're trying to uphold these moral principles. How does this work? Historically, there have been lots of attempts at how to transition a country from one type of leader to another. And so I'm going to give you some of those examples now. This is Napoleon Bonaparte. He was exiled. Exile just means you send the person away, out of sight, out of mind. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814, which you'll notice is not that far away from Italy, well, what becomes Italy. And so he was able to escape. And the European powers exiled him again. Instead of sending him to Elba in 1814, in 1815, they send him down here to St. Helena. They just exiled him. They just got rid of him, like physically removed him from the country and sent him as far away as they could the second time. You could execute the leader. This is from the French Revolution. This is the guillotine right here, and this is the head of King Louis XVI. Execution was very common for centuries, and the guillotine was supposed to be a more humane way to execute people. There were a lot more brutal ways to execute people before, but that was an option. You could hold a show trial. A show trial means that the defendant is already guilty. And the only reason they come into the courtroom is so that the judge can explain what they did, why they're guilty, here's your sentence, and that's it. And in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, that was very common in the 1930s to have these show trials. So you could do those things, exile, execution, show trials. You could actually do nothing. You could show mercy or clemency to the party that committed these crimes. This is what the realists would sometimes recommend. This is the realist position. And we've talked about realism because you might need to maintain peaceful relations with this country in the future. And if you do anything else, it could jeopardize that relationship. What's the anything else that you could do? Well, if you think about exile, execution, show trials, those are not going to help with the relationship. Having a legitimate trial might not help with the relationship either. The best example I can give you of that is from my own research. I look at the Nuremberg war crimes trial after World War II, and if you are interested in learning more about that, there will be a 2-part video all about Nuremberg that you can watch and learn more about that. But I think this is a good illustration of the differences between traditional justice and transitional justice, where traditional justice is just a sword. Transitional justice is more like a Swiss Army knife, where there are lots of options. You could have trials. You could have amnesty or clemency or mercy. You could have truth and reconciliation. So I want to run through those options here very briefly. I don't want to run out of time. We split these up into 2 different groups. You could have judicial options and non-judicial options. On the judicial side, we're talking about trials. Okay, so judicial is referring to a judge, a legally trained, objective person who can weigh the evidence and reach a fair verdict, one would hope. And so on the judicial side, international trials. Okay, this is from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or the ICTY, or the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR. Today, we have the Permanent International Criminal Court, which is sort of like the descendant of the Nuremberg trial. So we have international trials. We also have national trials, where the people of one country try someone from another country, but it's just held within that country. So this is a picture of Adolf Eichmann, who was a German Nazi criminal. and he was tried in Israel. It's a national trial. So one person from one country tried in another country. A domestic trial is where the people of one country try their own for atrocities. And here's Saddam Hussein, who was tried in Iraq by Iraqis. Hybrid trials, a good example of that is Cambodia. So the ECCC, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, were a hybrid between a domestic trial and an international trial. There were both aspects of that. And you can actually watch the hybrid trials, or the ECCC trials if you want to. On the non-judicial side, you have Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and this is from South Africa, but I want to show you just real quick, there was one in Greensboro. This is just incredible. Most students don't even know this, but there actually was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for events that happened in Greensboro in 1979. There was a shootout between members on the one side, between members of the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party. On the one side, they were shooting members of the Communist Workers' Party, and there was a shootout in Greensboro. People died. There was a Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the early 2000s, and in 2017, the Greensboro City Council officially apologized. If you're interested in learning more about that, by the way, you actually can watch a video of that. It's called Greensboro, Closer to the Truth. It's a documentary about the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I highly recommend it. Other non-judicial options include traditional informal justice mechanisms. And this is an example from Africa. This is called drinking the bitter root, where two parties will come together and drink from the same bowl to symbolize that they've reconciled. You can also have museums and memorials. This is also in Cambodia. This is a former high school that was converted into a museum memorial, and here are school students who come and they're learning about atrocities that happened in Cambodia around the time of the Vietnam War. So that's just a side-by-side comparison, judicial versus non-judicial. Now, let's talk briefly about some final thoughts here. When we talk about jus post bellum and transitional justice, there's often this debate, okay? If you want justice, where you go through a trial of some sort, then you might be able to pursue justice, but you're probably not going to get peace and reconciliation. This is usually presented as an either-or. You can pursue justice, or you can pursue peace and reconciliation, but you're probably not going to get all of those things. And I actually don't believe that. I actually believe that it might be possible to achieve all of those things. But it requires a lot of careful consideration and planning when you're thinking about what kind of steps should you take after a war is over to uphold the rights of everybody, uphold their human rights, and to make sure that you're not being unfair or incredibly biased in what you do. Capacity building and the rule of law are crucial. So the country that has gone through the ravages of war, a war-torn country, needs to have the capacity to have some kind of post-war, post-conflict reconciliation, whether it's a trial or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something. You've got to build up local communities to establish the rule of law, reestablish the rule of law. And that's just very important if you're going to have any kind of peace afterwards. Context matters. You've got to understand the political, cultural, and practical factors of the situation, period. Because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Whatever you do has to engage local communities. They have to have a sense of ownership. This is why international trials can be flawed if they don't feel like they're actually engaged in it. Complementary approaches. Whatever you end up doing, make sure they're not competing with each other. And expectations have to be realistic. You can't expect any transitional justice mechanism to solve every problem. But again, this goes along with jus post bellum, that if you're trying to help a country move on after war, you can't just execute people, okay? That's not going to work, especially in this day and age. So that's all I've got. Have a good day. I'll see you later.